what I have written down for you on the sheet is a series of 5 mitzvot that are contained. The first 4 are at the very end of Parsha Shoftim, and the 5th is at the beginning of Parsha Shoftim. And they are, and I have the full texts there printed for you, but just to review what these 5 mitzvahs are, is number 1, the law that the Kohen Mashuach Milchama, which is a certain Kohen who was specifically, his role was to sort of be to provide the pep rally for the soldiers before they went out to war. And he would say to them, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, my dutiful soldiers who are about to go out to war to conquer the land of Israel. Atem kerevim hayom lamilchama lo oyevechem. You're about to go out to war against your enemies. Do not be frightened. Do not fear. Hashem is going to be with you, and He's going to be there to make sure that you're successful. And then, of course, in the course of this commandment, the Torah just says that there are certain exemptions from battle. And if you're a newlywed, or if you've just built a home and so forth, you're exempt from going to war. This is all part of the words of the Kohen Mashuach Milchama. And he also says if a person is yellow and cannot tolerate the violence of the battlefield, you are also exempt, so that you do not infect the rest of your comrades with this sense of fear. So that's the mitzvah that appears at the beginning of chapter Chaf of Perek Chaf, Psukim Aleph through Tes. Next mitzvah. When you go out to war, when you come to a city and you besiege the city, you shall first call out to it in peace and give the indigenous nations of the land of Canaan the opportunity to surrender. In other words, violence is your last course of action, right? It's your last resort, not your first resort. So you have to give people the opportunity to surrender and make peace, and only if they refuse are you going to go into battle. Okay. Mitzvah number 3, which is in Psukim 19 and 20 of that very same chapter. Ki tatzur el ir yamim rabim, when you besiege a city and you need to go in and wage battle because they have refused to surrender. Lo tashchit et etza, lindoach alav garzen, ki mimenu tochel v'yosolo sichros. You're not allowed to destroy the beautiful orchards of that city. In other words, do not be wantonly destructive in the course of battle. Okay, so that's the mitzvah of bal tashchis, but it refers specifically when you're besieging a city in the course of battle. That's mitzvah number 3 in this list. Mitzvah number 4 is the mitzvah of egla arufa, which many of you may have heard of before. And that's the mitzvah where if a corpse is found outside of a city, this is during peacetime, a corpse is found outside of the city in Jewish Israel, and you don't know who the murderer was, then whichever city the corpse is closest to has to do a service that atones for the fact that this person died or was murdered within the environs of our city. And we didn't do what we should have done to protect this person from violence. And therefore we have to take a calf and use this calf as a sacrificial substitute for this individual or for ourselves. We have to offer this up to Hashem and say, we hereby ask you, Hashem, to atone for our sin of not having treated this person properly and not having escorted him out of the city, etc. That's the mitzvah of egla arufa. Mitzvah number 5 in this list is now we get to the beginning of next week's parsha. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and you find after the battle, you find an Eshes Yifas Toar. You find a beautiful woman from among the indigenous nations, and you fall in love, and you want to get married. So the Torah gives you a way, a heter, a way of being allowed to marry this woman and convert her to Judaism and marry her in a permissible fashion. Okay, so those are the 5 mitzvahs that I've detailed for you, one after the other in succession, beginning with the beginning of Perek Chaf in Parsha Shoftim, going through the middle of Perek Chaf Aleph, beginning in Parshas Kitetse. So here's the quiz part, okay? One of these things is not like the other. So you have 5 mitzvahs. Which mitzvah stands out in your mind as being completely dissimilar to all the others? Yes, Mrs. Kashana. What? The tree, why? Why is that?
Because with the Kohen, he's giving them chizuk to go out, telling them what's good, that this is how you should be leading to war. And the other thing is about if you go out to war, you have to offer peace before you go into battle. The Eglah Arufa is...
Okay, give it some more thought.
Could be associated with war as well, because if you find a body not in the city as well.
Okay. All right. So 3 or 4. Give us think.
4. I think 4 it doesn't belong.
So as you were saying, number 4.
So not a wartime mitzvah.
Number 4 is not a wartime mitzvah. Exactly. Okay. Right. Number 4 is not a wartime mitzvah. The only one of these mitzvahs that is dissimilar in the sense that it doesn't relate to milchama, that it doesn't relate to war, is the mitzvah of Eglah Arufa. As I mentioned, it's a peacetime mitzvah. It's specifically that when the Jewish communities and cities and villages are settled, then you find a corpse during peacetime, then this is the protocol that you're supposed to do. So the question that the Rishonim and many of the other commentators ask is, why is this stuck in the middle of an entire section of the Torah which deals with going out to war when it has nothing to do with war? It has nothing to do with maritime activity, or martial activity, I should say. Okay, so we have a number of answers to this question. If you turn over the page, you'll take a look at some of the different interpretations. I have here the Ibn Ezra and the Abarbanel. Each one offers a different answer. The Ibn Ezra suggests, if you take a look, he says, Kitetse, at the beginning of Parshas Kitetse, which is next week's Parsha, Ibn Ezra starts off by saying, what does this mitzvah of Yeshus Yifas Toar have to do with our previous Parsha, Parsha Shoftim? He says, Zu ha-parasha deveka im kitatzur elir. It's really attached to mitzvah number 3 on the list, which is when you go and besiege a city, don't destroy the trees. And in a similar vein, when after you besiege the city and you find a beautiful woman in the city, here's how you can marry her. V'nichnesa beinehem parshas Eglah Arufa. So why is this mitzvah of Eglah Arufa stuck in between? What's it doing there? So the Ibn Ezra says, Ba'avur hachalal hanimsa be'eretz Yisrael, v'lo ken chutz la'aretz, va'af ki ba'milchama. It's a little bit cryptic. The Ibn Ezra Kedarko Ba'Kodesh many times writes in a cryptic fashion. But what he essentially is saying is as follows. All of the mitzvot at the end of Parsha Shoftim have one common theme, and that is they only apply in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the first 4 mitzvos, even the mitzvah of Eglah Arufa, even though it doesn't have to do with wartime, still is a mitzvah that can only be practiced in Eretz Yisrael. There's no mitzvah of Eglah Arufa if you're in Toronto and you find a corpse right outside of Thornhill. They don't bring an Eglah Arufa, okay? But it only applies in Eretz Yisrael. The other mitzvahs as well, about besieging a city and not destroying the fruit trees because the fruit trees of Eretz Yisrael have a special status, that also applies only within Eretz Yisrael. Offering peace before war also only applies in Eretz Yisrael. But if you're going to go out to war in Syria or in Jordan or in Egypt, there are times when the Torah gives you permission to wage war with neighboring nations. And the mitzvah of Yeshus Yifas Toar applies equally to both wartime with the indigenous nations of Canaan inside of the land of Israel, and to waging battles with all the nations that are around you as well. So if you wanted to marry a beautiful Egyptian woman, a beautiful Jordanian, or a beautiful Syrian woman, the Torah provides you with a solution about how to do that. So that's the Ibn Ezra's explanation as to why Egla Arufa appears in the middle of all of this discussion of wartime, because the Torah wanted to finish its discussion of mitzvot that apply exclusively in Eretz Yisrael before discussing a mitzvah that applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. Yeah?
So when the Bnei Yisrael came into the wars of conquest against the Sheva Alamin, this law of offering peace applied to them as well?
Yes, absolutely. It applies specifically to the Shiva Amim. It doesn't apply to other kinds of warfare. In other words, if our tacticians and our generals of the army make a determination that by trying to make peace with Egypt or with Jordan or with Syria, we're actually going to be in a compromised position, then we don't have to take that first option. We can go ahead and tell Syria, you know what our first course of action is? Attack. But when it comes to the indigenous nations, the Shiva Amimim, we first have to try and make shalom and offer them the opportunity to surrender and vacate. If they don't, then they are attacked. That's the opinion of the Ibn Ezra. The opinion of the Abarbanel is a little bit different. And he challenges the Ibn Ezra a little bit before. I don't have that portion quoted for you. But he challenges the Ibn Ezra. He says, Ibn Ezra, I don't understand. You explain why Egla Arufa appears at the end of Parsha Shoftim because it's one of those mitzvot that can only be practiced inside of Eretz Yisrael. But there are plenty of mitzvot that can only be practiced inside of Eretz Yisrael. Why specifically choose Egla Arufa as sort of like part of that comprehensive list? You couldn't think of any other mitzvah that's only practicable inside Eretz Yisrael except for Egla Arufa. Come on. That's not a comprehensive answer. So explains the Abarbanel. He says, this is again at the beginning of Parshas Kiteitzei, and he says, Kavar hiskarti mechochmat sidur sidrei haTorah she'asa mi Parshas re'ei anochi ad shoftim v'shotrim seder echad. He says, the Abarbanel says, I've already demonstrated how from the beginning of Parshas Re'ei until the end of Parsha Shoftim are all one unit on a conceptual basis. From the beginning of last week's Parsha to the end of this week's Parsha is all one unit. Why? Higid bo Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom eich yitnaheg ha'adam la'avod et bor'o b'chol levavo u'b'chol nafsho u'b'chol ma'odo kemo shezacharti. Excuse me. From the beginning of Re'eh until the beginning of Shoftim, I should say, is all about how Moshe Rabbeinu organized a whole collection of mitzvot, exhorting the Jews to serve God with all their might and with all their abilities and with all their soul. The Asa Seder Acher Mishoftim V'Shotrim Adpo. Then there's another section from Shoftim V'Shotrim until Parshas Kiteitzei, which is what? What's the theme? Lahagid bo hahanhagot hakolelet shahayu b'Yisrael enoshiot v'ruchniot kemo shezacharti. That he says that there are certain communal laws that have to be governed over by official bodies of government, and that's what Parsha Shoftim is about. Setting up a judiciary, setting up a police force, setting up systems of government that govern instances which affect society or communities as a whole. That's what Parsha Shoftim is all about. And therefore, he says, the Seder Acher b'dinim ha'paratiyim shebein ha'adam la'atzmo uveino la'chavero b'seder kiteitzei la'milchama. What is Parshas Kiteitzei all about? It's about mitzvot that apply to the individual, not to the society or to the community. So the Abarbanel has a different answer. It's got the distinction is not between laws that apply only in Israel and laws that apply outside of Israel, but the distinction between Parsha Shoftim and Parshas Kiteitzei is Parsha Shoftim applies to communal laws, governmental laws, and that would explain why the law of Egla Arufa is grouped together with the other laws having to do with wartime, because the military is a communal organization. It's an organization of the government, of the Jewish community as a whole, not having to do with individuals. And therefore, the law of Eglah Arufa is a communal mitzvah. It can only be practiced by a town or a city, not by an individual. And therefore, it's grouped together with the other laws of going out to war. Whereas the mitzvah of Eshes Yifas Toar, while we grant you that it has this commonality to the previous mitzvahs because it has to do with the military, but it applies to the individual soldier, not to the army as a whole. So you see, that's the distinction that the Abarbanel draws. That's the dividing line. And therefore, it makes sense for the Abarbanel why the mitzvah of Eglah Arufa divides between the mitzvah of Bal Tashchis and the mitzvah of Eshes Yifas Toar. So we have two very legitimate explanations as to the ordering of the mitzvahs at the end of Parsha Shoftim before we begin Parshas Ki Teitzei. I'm just going to offer you one other idea, which I think has a very important theme. And this is brought down in the Sefer Kehilas Yitzchak, where he quotes from Rabbi Yaakov de Vilna. And he says as follows. And this, of course, this is either an 18th or 19th century Sefer. It's a more recent Sefer going much later than the Ibn Ezra and the Abarbanel. And he says, one of the hazards of a nation or a community going out to war is that it desensitizes the community. When a community is in a time of war, then human life for the entire community has less value. There's less value placed upon human life because we have to be callous. We have to be insensitive in order to be able to be good soldiers. We have to be able to be strong and say to ourselves, even though human life is infinitely precious and we have to do whatever we can to preserve life, when we are told that it's time to go to war and we have to defeat the enemy, we can't have compassion on the battlefield. And it is specifically at the time of war where we have to sort of sometimes remind ourselves, or the Torah has to remind us, that as you go through an entire sequence of mitzvot having to do with killing the enemy, that realize that God still hasn't forgotten about the infinite value of human life. And that's why sandwiched in between all of the mitzvahs of going out to war is a reminder that even one life lost because of human negligence at a time of peace has to be atoned for. And we have to make a reckoning if even one human life is lost. That's why it's specifically over here. And we can point to a commentary of the Or HaChaim HaKadosh from last week's Parsha, from Parshas Re'eh. The Torah says, there was a mitzvah that we read about in last week's Parsha called the mitzvah of Ir Hanidachas. When an entire city of our own people is found to be idolatrous. They're going to be, God says you're going to go to the land of Israel and you're going to spread out, you're going to want to establish your own communities. And there may come a time when an entire community, somewhere up north or down south in Eretz Yisrael, decides that the entire standards of the community are going to be to embrace idolatry instead of serving Hashem. And they'll erect temples in that city or that town. Then what are you supposed to do? So the Torah gives a very extreme and harsh mitzvah called Ir Hanidachas, where the Torah requires us to wipe out everything in that city. Every man, woman, child, and animal has to be completely killed. Everything in that city has to be burned to the ground. We have to completely eradicate everything within that city in order to completely uproot the threat of idolatry within the Jewish society. That's the mitzvah of Ir Hanidachas. And perhaps it requires further analysis, but not for now. In the course of the Torah encouraging the Jewish people to fulfill this mitzvah, the Torah says, "V'nosan lecha rachamim v'richamcha v'yirvecha," that if you do this mitzvah properly, God will bestow you with mercy and He will have compassion upon you and He will increase you. Don't think that by decimating an entire city in Eretz Yisrael, you are doing something that's going to compromise the future of the Jewish people. Just the opposite. This will help you become stronger and propagate even further. So on the words, V'nosan lecha rachamim, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh says something fascinating. He says, Kavanat ma'amar zekan. He says, what the Torah is trying to convey by telling us these words, that God will give you mercy, is Lefi shetziva al ir hanidachat sheyahargu kol ha'ir lefi charev va'afilu behemtam. He says, because when you consider what God is telling us to do, He's saying, wipe out and kill everything that's living in that city, even the animals. Ma'aseh hazeh yoliteva ha'achzariyut b'leiv ha'adam. He says, that kind of behavior only naturally engenders within the human beings that carry out this mitzvah a sense of cruelty. And God says that people might be worried. He says, He says, this is what the Arabs tell us. See, the Arabs in Rav Chaim Attar's time also were quite violent and terrorists by nature. And he says, the Arabs tell us that when you get into the mode of killing, you become completely desensitized to the value of human life. You are filled with a bloodlust, and you forget all about any sense of compassion. You become completely discompassionate and cruel, and you even enjoy the thrusting of the sword into your victim and the taking of his life. He says, and this kind of trait, the fear is, will be embedded and entrenched within the hearts of all those who carry out this command of to wipe out the ir hanidachas. So lazeh amar lahem havtacha sheyitain lahem Hashem rachamim agam shahateva yoli b'hem achzarius makor harachamim yashpia b'hem koach harachamim mechadash levatel koach ha'achzariut shenolad b'hem mikoach ha'ma'aseh. Says God says, don't worry. I know that your fear is that you're going to become cruel people. You're going to become people who are completely calloused and insensitive to human life. But I promise you, says Hashem, I will create a metaphysical upheaval such that even when you're in the midst of doing the most cruel and dispassionate act, the aftermath will be that you'll even have more racham. I'll imbue you with even greater sense of compassion after the war is over, after what you've done to wipe out the Arnidachas is finished. Don't be fearful about being left with this sense of callousness. Hashem says, I'll compensate for that and imbue you with greater rachamim. So v'nosam lecha rachamim is not that God will have mercy on you. He will give you rachamim. He will make you compassionate people, even though that's counterintuitive to what you're doing. And as a result, what the Torah is trying to tell us over here is that don't fear going out to battle, but at the same time realize that even when you're going out to battle, you can never forget about the infinite value of human life. There's an interesting Gemara that we don't have time to read inside, but the Gemara in Yoma, and Chaf Bet, which you have here in your handout, says that Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, was commanded by God to wipe out the nation of Amalek. We read about this story on the Shabbos before Purim, on Parsha Shoftim. You're all familiar with the story. And he went ahead and neglected to fulfill the command in its entirety. He ended up not wiping out the animals. He ended up not killing all of the people as he was supposed to. He only killed some of the people. And as a result, he was stripped of his monarchy, and Hashem became very upset with him via the prophet Shmuel. And the Gemara explains that the basis of Shaul HaMelech's error was the mitzvah of Egla Arufa. And it says, the Gemara, that he made the following kal v'chomer. And he said, Uma nefesh achas amra Torah have Egla Arufa. He says, if even for one soul that is lost, the Torah says you need an atonement to bring this Egla Arufa, Kol hanefashos halalu al achas kama v'kama. So then surely, for all of the souls that we are destroying among Amalek, how much more so do we have this obligation? Now at face value, this Gemara makes absolutely no sense. King Saul doesn't know that there's a basic mitzvah to go out to war against Amalek and to destroy them. How can he possibly make this kind of argument just based on the mitzvah of Egla Arufa? So the way we're explaining it is that it's not that he was literally saying that we have to spare Amalek, but he had a misplaced sense of compassion on Amalek based upon the innate sensitivity of this mitzvah of Egla Arufa. And what the message of this Gemara is, that while it's necessary to be discompassionate during a time of war, you cannot focus on the Egla Arufa when you're going out to the battlefield. You have to be a mercenary, and you have to be strong and heartless in order to be successful during war. But immediately before war and immediately after war, you have to remember about the infinite preciousness and value of life. Shaul's mistake is that he remembered and thought about it while he was going out to war. That's what the error was. But nevertheless, the message of the Egla Rufa is necessary to remember while you're involved in a period of war. Sometimes we misplace compassion, and we're compassionate on those who we're not supposed to be compassionate to, and we're cruel to the people who should be sources of compassion. We have to know how to compartmentalize the issues properly, but at least now we understand why the mitzvah of Egla Rufa is in the middle of all of these mitzvahs having to do with wartime. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.